Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. By the way, if you're one of those people who feel really agitated, feel very annoyed whenever you hear most authentic voice, stay tuned for the next 2-3 minutes where I'll kind of be dealing with that aspect, and hopefully that'll help you make peace or even get more agitated with this whole idea of most authentic voice in true crime. In terms of this episode, apparently a family member who knows the quote-unquote real story behind what really happened has posted anonymously on a Facebook group, and I'll put that up, the full 3 sort of page post at the end of this analysis. But here's a sneak peek. And there's some people who are wondering whether this is posted by, if the family member is one of his sisters. This family member is convinced Kohberger is innocent and blames something I feel is also a factor in the story, both in terms of the past and possibly in terms of the present leading up to the crime as well. Right? Can you see what that is? Whether Brian is innocent or not, these are 10 omens that ought to have been a warning that things weren't going to end well for him in the near future. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Again, if you are really irritated by this really arrogant claim that this is the most authentic voice in true crime, and I actually have heard some people say,
I'm afraid there's just nothing special about you.
And that got me thinking, am I different to any of the other YouTubers? I suppose there is one difference between me and not only every YouTuber in true crime, but the entirety of YouTube. I'm the only creator I know of who has also written over 100 books. And so with that out of the way, if you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So 10 omens. Number 1, cops outside his apartment. Imagine a premeditated murder scenario where the perpetrator has his badass K-bar knife sheathed and ready, his bought clothing, black clothing, is dressed to kill in every way that's not good, and the first thing he sees is red and blue flashing right outside his apartment when he steps out. He drives right past this elevated police presence, and bear in mind he's got to come back through that presence as well. And what happens is it's late at night, and those ruby lights, like warning lights in a dark cockpit, they begin receding in his rearview mirror as he heads out into the dark. According to The Independent, quote, at around 11:40 p.m., 20 minutes to midnight, on the night of 12 November, Saturday night, the night of that football game, police were called to a report of a crash in front of an apartment complex on the Washington State University campus in Pullman. The apartment complex, the article goes on to note that this apartment complex, which houses mainly graduate or PhD students, had been home to Kohberger since August, when he relocated from his home state of Pennsylvania. Right? When officers arrived on the scene, they found 2 pedestrians, a male WSU student and a woman with injuries, and they'd just been struck by a car. The driver actually fled the scene, and later they actually tracked this driver down. Hours later, it turned out to be a 19-year-old student, Carmen Fernandez, and she was arrested and charged with DUI, also felony vehicular assault and hit and run. Now, it's not clear whether Kohberger saw this hit and run or certainly saw the aftermath, all the police cars and ambulance, but you would imagine he had to have heard it. And, I mean, all of this was taking place within line of sight of his apartment. But one thing that is certain is these investigators and cops and cop cars were still on the scene of the crash at the housing complex when Kohberger left his home in the early hours of 30 November. We know this because cell phone data detailed in the probable cause affidavit places Kohberger at home inside the apartment complex when the crash took place, with his phone pinging on a nearby mast up until 2:42 a.m. So it was basically 2 hours later that he only left. And what this means is that there's possibly body cam as well from those officers in Pullman that might or might not show the Elantra leaving for the hunt in Moscow. Another possibility is that that crash and the police presence may have given him a sense that that would be what the local cops should be focused on that night, right? And it could also have been something that roused him out of whatever mood he was in that particular night as well. In other words, someone had been injured right next door to him in kind of a brutal way. So that's number one. Number two, cops at Band Field. So when he's less than half a mile away from his destination, as he approaches King Road, he passes additional cops, this time in plain clothes and using an unmarked car. It's likely if Kohberger passes them once or even a few times that their flashlights make it obvious that it's not some casual encounter, that it is actually law enforcement doing its thing. And you would imagine for a kid studying criminology, he had to at least assume that what he was seeing was law enforcement going after underage drinking. Number three, the DoorDash delivery. You'd imagine that after circling the residence 3 times that night, that Xana's DoorDash delivery right at the death, right at the last moment at 4 a.m. ought to have spooked Kohberger if he had any criminal intent. On the other hand, perhaps he didn't see it, but if that's the case, then his reconnaissance was particularly poor. On the other hand, if he saw the DoorDash delivery and persisted regardless, that is one relentless SOB we're dealing with. You kind of get the idea that for whoever committed the crime, Saturday night going into Sunday morning was the night. He was primed, he was rigged to blow, and come hell or high water, he was going to go ahead with it no matter what. Number 4, the vehicles that were parked outside, the new Range Rover and Ethan's vehicle parked outside. If Kohberger had been eyeing the activity around the funhouse for weeks, one would imagine he would have some idea about whose vehicle belonged to whom. If so, what did he make of the new Range Rover parked right outside the door? Had he attached that to a particular individual? And did he realize the red Jeep parked to one side belonged to a guy, Ethan? Or didn't he care? Or didn't he make sure? Number 5, Ring doorbell camera 50 feet away. If the first 4 red flags weren't already whipping and snapping hard and loudly in a high shrieking wind in terms of his mind, in terms of his inner narrative, a cursory glance at the house right next door to 112 to King Road ought to have nixed any plan in the bud. A Ring doorbell camera outside 1112 King Road was yet another ominous sign that committing a crime around here at any time of the day or night was ill-advised. And I think that camera was installed somewhere around February or March 2022. So it was there well before he arrived in June. And so what this suggests is the suspect's basic attention to detail was surprisingly crap. Number 6, Murphy's Law. If attention to detail wasn't the suspect's strong suit, and now we have him not noticing Ethan's red Jeep, not noticing the Ring doorbell camera, and possibly not even knowing or caring about the DoorDash delivery, well then add Murphy to that list. If the suspect thought he'd just show up and see how it went, a little like Jake Sully in Avadar, well, he thought wrong.
So you just figured you'd come out here and see how it went?
Well, whatever he thought wrong. Whatever he did, it went wrong. Because Murphy basically acted like a house alarm. Even the camera next door picked up barking at 4:17 a.m. Number 7, news reports of white Elantra. News reports came through on December 7th when Kohberger was still in Pullman and prior to his father flying in, of a white Elantra that they were looking for. As a matter of fact, by November 29th, more than a week earlier, they already knew who the owner was of that white Elantra in Washington, and found it interesting that that owner hadn't raised his hand and said, "Hi, I have an Elantra." Had any of his neighbors called in about that Elantra? In fact, the Elantra had been on the cops' radar since day one, not November 29th, when a second camera in Linda Lane had also picked up the vehicle driving by, and then an additional camera at a food mart as well. The driver of the Elantra had to have been thinking, if it's taken 3 weeks to come up with a white car, and they don't even have the ballpark manufacturing date, well, they really don't have much. Of course, it hadn't taken 3 weeks. In other words, instead of worrying on December 7th, about what the police had found, I think he was thinking, well, they've got the wrong manufacturing date, and that maybe that gave him a false sense of confidence. And when they got the right manufacturing date, they also didn't let the public know, or him know for that matter. So it does seem as if our suspect suffers from overconfidence, and that is how he was able to bypass all 10 of these omens to get to, well, where he eventually got to. Number 8, no news reports of knife sheath. The suspect lost the knife sheath he knew he had, but it's likely he didn't know for sure where he'd lost it or dropped it. The cops remaining mum on this crucial piece of evidence, and evidence they also had since the very beginning, would have given him a false sense that he may have dropped it outside the home, and of the cops have nothing. Number 9, Steve Gonzalez stops criticizing the cops. Now, you would imagine a suspect with a background in criminology would have the equivalent of a spidey sense, a tingling sense that something's wrong. And so when Kaylee's dad suddenly stopped criticizing the cops, and that criticism must have been music to the suspect's ears every time he heard it, but when it stopped, did his spidey senses start tingling? Or was he too high on his own hubris by then to notice? Number 10, 2 police stops in Indiana. Now, you'd think that the type of the stops in Indiana would have given even the most lazy suspect a reality check, that at any moment the cops could sort of knock on his window or knock on his door, and who's to say whether it wouldn't be with bad news, really bad news. And yet Kohberger responded to that by cleaning his vehicle and taking out the trash, seemingly with no clue that they were still watching him. It was so obvious what he was doing that they saw that he was wearing surgical gloves. This alone suggests the black nitrile glove found in his apartment might not necessarily be innocent, but even if it is, nitrile gloves probably were chosen by the killer to contain his DNA. It does seem like this is the sort of the gloves of choice of this particular individual. But think about it, it's not the best clothing, the gloves or the face mask, for the crime the suspect was hoping to get away with. A crime where you're going to have a face-to-face encounter with 4 different individuals, one of them a male. And this brings us back to the alleged family statement, pitching the idea that drugs are the reason this crime happened. According to this post, Brian is innocent, and you'll see he has been framed by his drug partner friend, and who is the security guard from the university. They were doing drugs together in the parking lot, as they had done numerous times, but when the security guard started acting like a peeping Tom, I wonder where those words came from, outside the girl's window, Brian left the security guard and drove back to his apartment. The reason the phone was off is because the battery was flat and the security guard was using the car charger. Brian put his phone on charge when he left the parking lot, and he switched it back on when he was near to his apartment, because that's how long it took to get a charge going, really. Brian's knife was in the car, and the security guard was holding it because he used it to chop the cocaine lines. And then she says cocaine helps him with his bad migraines. He had no idea the security guard was going to do what he did, and he just wanted to teach the security guard a lesson by leaving him behind. And so if that was the case, why not call the authorities? Why not say, it's my Elantra, and I know who did this? So anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that, but I am going to go further into some areas of analysis that we haven't seen, I certainly haven't seen before. And then we're also going to deal with decoding those statements that Dee made. So look out for that. For those interested in the Alec Baldwin saga, there's a humdinger of a video that is going to be following this video. And I'll be showing you some incredible images from the Rust set and from the ammunition supplier that comes from the affidavit and other legal documents. So if you haven't paid attention to any information on Alec Baldwin, don't miss this video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.